Okay, welcome everyone to our webinar, giving you some insights from RSC Journal editors, which is part of our celebration for this year's Peer Review Week. I should start by introducing myself. My name is Nicola Nugent, and I'm the Publishing Manager, Quality and Ethics at Royal Society of Chemistry, which means I'm responsible for ensuring that the peer review across our journals is high quality and rigorous, and also fair and inclusive. And I'll be here to both introduce our session and our fantastic speakers, and also to moderate the discussion at the end. Before we start the session proper, I just want to cover a little bit of housekeeping. As attendees, you will remain muted with your cameras off throughout, but of course we very much still want to hear from you. So please do use the chat function for general comments or discussion with each other. But if you want to ask the speakers a question, please do make sure you use the Q&A function in your toolbar. That's easier for us to manage. Questions in the chat can easily get lost. And if you use the Q&A function, others can also upvote your question. So without further ado, let's get started with our session. Before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to just remind you all about who we are at Royal Society of Chemistry. We're a learned society and a professional body, as well as a publisher. And our purpose is to help the chemical science community to make the world a better place. Our vision is a world in which the chemical sciences fulfill their potential as a force for good. And part of our mission is to provide the opportunities and tools for the chemical science community to network, to create and exchange knowledge, and to adapt and thrive. And that creating and exchanging knowledge is where our publishing activities come in. So we publish over 50 journals across the breadth of the chemical sciences and related fields, and our journals are really known for rigorous, fair peer review and fast publication times. And we always aim to publish the best science, whether that's original research articles or authoritative reviews. So here are our speakers for today. We'll hear from Sarah Whitbread, who's one of our editorial production managers, Jeremy Allen, one of our executive editors, and Laura Fisher, another of our executive editors. And as I say, I'll be here to help moderate the Q&A and the discussion at the end of the session. In terms of our agenda for today, Sarah will take us through some of the details and information about how the peer review process works. Jeremy is going to cover off different types of peer review, different peer review models. And then Laura will talk to us about becoming a reviewer and carrying out review, and also about upholding ethical standards. So that's it from me. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Sarah, who will talk to us about the peer review process. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Nicola. Hi, everyone. As Nicola mentioned, my name is Sarah Whitbread, and I'm an editorial production manager for one of our journals teams at the RSC. So I'm responsible for the peer review process of all articles submitted to the journals that I work on, all the way through from submission to acceptance. So I'd like to start by talking about why we use peer review. So the main aim of peer review is to improve the paper and to assure the quality of the research. And there's many benefits for authors, readers, and reviewers. So for authors, this improves the article. It's a mark of quality as well, and it shows that it's been through robust peer review at the RSC. And it's a requirement for publication in our scientific journals, and also validates the research. For readers, again, it's a mark of quality and improves the research. You know what you're reading basically is high quality work in an RSC journal. And for reviewers, they can enjoy reading new work when they provide a review report, keeping up to date with the field because they're reading and evaluating new work yet to be published. And they can also record this as a professional activity. And Laura Fisher, I believe, will be talking more about this in one of her presentations. So I'd now like to talk about what an editor does. So next slide, please, Nicola. So an editor is a key role in the publication process. They manage the peer review all the way through the process, so selecting reviewers and then making that final decision on a paper. So we interpret the review reports, make that decision, and also mediate between reviewers and authors on what changes are potentially needed on the paper. We also ensure fairness and quality standards across all of our RSC journals are followed to that same standard. And we, as I said, we make that final decision about publication based on the reviewer recommendations. We also oversee the whole publication process. So we have colleagues in our publishing department that oversee editing, proofing and formatting of papers, and also colleagues that oversee the dissemination and promotion of the work through our channels and also social media channels, for example. But today, the main bulk of the presentation is going to be on the manuscript life cycle. So next slide, please, Nicola. And here I've just got the full life cycle up for you, just to summarise first of all. What happens is that a paper is submitted, it goes for an assessment, and then it can go through peer review. If it passes that initial assessment, it's evaluated by editors. As I mentioned, we make decisions on the manuscript, and then an article is ultimately accepted or rejected from publication in the journal. So first of all, Nicola, next slide, please. I'll just break this down now. So a manuscript is submitted, of course, it's submitted through our ScholarOne platform to the particular journal that it's being submitted to from the author. And then next slide, please. It goes through an initial assessment by editors. So this might be in-house editorial staff members, or it might be external associate editors who are experts in the area and practicing researchers. So as I mentioned, it goes through an initial assessment. So this is to see whether a paper is suitable for peer review or not, and any papers that are clearly unsuitable for the journal are rejected without sending them to peer review. And this is based on the scope and the impact of the journal, for example, and what we're looking for in papers. So although it's not a nice decision to get a rejection decision, there are some benefits for pre-screening, so you can get a decision faster, and this also reduces burden on reviewers, and it allows authors to submit to a more suitable journal much sooner than if they would go through that peer review process and possibly be ultimately rejected then. So I'd like to explain a little bit more about the initial assessment process, what we look for, and then I'll touch on transfers as well. So this slide talks about the questions that each editor asks when we're doing an initial assessment. So all articles submitted to RSC journals are assessed against the scope and standards of the particular journal that the editor is working on. And there's a link on this slide. So for example, if you were to click on this, you can follow it through to all of our RSC journals and see the scope requirements there. We also ask several questions of the paper when we're doing an initial assessment. And we also ask these questions after peer review as well, when we've got those reviewer recommendations and we're making that decision on the paper. So these questions include whether the scientific research in the paper is correct and robust. We want to know whether the paper is ethically sound, are there any concerns at all, any unsupported claims, that kind of thing. We're also looking if the science is communicated clearly and in a way that can be easily understood to the readership of the journal, as well as whether the manuscript presents new insights that will genuinely add to the existing literature and be of broad interest to the audience. So, will the readership want to read this paper? I mentioned a bit about transfers as well. So on the next slide, I've got some information about transfers. So if we do reject an article from an RSC journal, we like to try as best as possible to offer a transfer to the authors and to find a suitable home for their research. So just because a paper is rejected from an RSC journal doesn't mean that we think it's unsuitable for publication in all journals. And in fact, there is probably very likely a journal that we'd be happy to publish the research in. And transfers are offered both before and after peer review. So there are some benefits to our reviewers and our editors to transfers. So this is because we share peer review reports with the editors of the new journals. So if a transfer is made after peer review, and the transfer is taken up by the authors, that new journal will receive the reports, and then the peer review process is a lot quicker and smoother. Of course, this is for RSC journals only. There are also lots of benefits that you can see for authors. So it provides authors with a quicker decision. It's much easier to submit to another journal with a transfer link, because you can just follow that link through and you don't need to upload any additional files. You use the same files. And often, if it is after peer review, no further peer review may be needed, and sometimes even no revisions. But this does depend on the particular manuscript, and any details of this will be outlined in the decision letter, that authors receive. So I'd like to go back to the manuscript life cycle diagram now. So we've gone through that initial assessment stage, and then rejection without peer review potentially as an option, or the other option is to send to peer review. So in this stage, we like to receive usually at least 2 review reports, and our journals are quite fast. Typically, an author may expect to receive a first decision after peer review after about a month on average for RSC journals. I say at least 2 reports. This may be because we might also invite an adjudicative reviewer if we have conflicting recommendations. This may be someone who is very experienced with the journal, or even possibly a board member. So there is that option to have for within peer review for editors. I'd like to talk a bit more about reviewer selection now, and what we do when we select a reviewer, and also questions that we ask for reviewers as well. So one of the top priorities for reviewers are, do they have that specialist knowledge of the paper? Are they experts in that field? So, some experience with the journal before is also beneficial, but it's not essential, as we do like to introduce new reviewers to build up their reviewing experience with RSC journals. You can see I've also put down speed, reliability, and accuracy, and these are things we look at based on their previous peer review experience with us. So, for example, how quickly they provide a report. Then reliability. So if we invite someone, if they agree, how likely are they to A, agree, and B, provide a report? And then finally, accuracy. So is the recommendation that they're making normally in line with editor decisions, or do they, for example, recommend rejecting everything or accepting everything? This does, of course, depend on the type of papers that they review, but we do want well-balanced reviewers that we can trust their report. So the questions that we ask from the reviewers, you can see on the slide there. So basically around the correctness of the experimental work in the paper. And we also ask them questions about their opinion of the novelty and impact of the work. So some of our journals require different levels of impact and novelty depending on where they fit in our portfolio. We also ask them about the suitability for publication in the particular journal that they're reviewing it for. Is it in scope? Is it going to reach the right audience, for example? And then finally, we'd like them to make a recommendation. So whether that's accept, reject, or possibly revisions are needed. And then, as I've said before, the editor then makes that decision based on the peer review recommendations. So just going back again to the life cycle diagram that I showed you earlier, this is the full diagram again. So after peer review, reports are received. They are then evaluated by editors, and then an accept or a reject decision is made. Where we reject, we try to offer a transfer where possible, and when it's accept, authors may need to do some revisions depending on the review reports. Something I haven't mentioned here, just quickly, that I'd like to add is the appeals process. So this isn't common, but we do recognise that the peer review system isn't perfect, and on occasion authors may fundamentally disagree with either the comments of the reviewers or the decision to reject a paper, and authors are welcome to provide a rebuttal letter outlining why they disagree. And then the editor can consider that going forwards. But any decision on appeals by the editor are final. So that's the whole process. Hopefully that explains a bit more about what the peer review looks like overall in terms of a manuscript lifecycle at the RSC. And I'll pass it back to Nicola now to introduce the other talks.
Thanks very much, Sarah. That was great. So I'm going to move straight on to our second section with Jeremy Allen. So take it away, Jeremy.
Great. Thanks, Nicola. And I'd just like to give my own welcome and thank you to everyone for tuning in. As Nicola introduced me earlier, I'm Jeremy Allen. I'm an executive editor at the RSC. And I'm going to be talking about different peer review models and different types. My colleague Sarah just talked about what peer review is and how it's done, and now this is the next stage. And many ways, like the donuts in this picture, there are a number of different flavors to peer review. So it's important to put some thought into exactly what flavor you're after before submitting your manuscript. If you'd like to move on to the next slide, thank you. So before we talk about different peer review models, I just want to say a note about different editor models that are in operation with different journals. This will vary very much by publisher and by journal, but it's important that if you have a particular route that you want to go down, that you look into exactly what happens at that journal before submitting. So some journals will be run solely by professional editors. They'll have an editorial office. For example, the nature journals are run primarily like this. Energy and Environmental Science from the RSC is run by an editorial office as well. Other journals will be purely, all submissions will be purely managed by academic or associate editors. And these are active researchers who are doing their editorial work as kind of on the side of their professional responsibilities at their university or institution. And there's a few examples of these types of journals on the slide here. And then there's some journals that are kind of split between the two. And some submissions will be handled by an editorial office. Some submissions will be handled by an academic or associate editor. And some journals, it might vary a little bit based on the stage of the manuscript. So Sarah mentioned that the first stage in the peer review cycle is an initial assessment stage. And some journals, this will be carried out by an editorial office with them. Or the editorial office will have a first pass at manuscripts to check for journal scope and suitability, and then they'll pass to academic editors. Most journals should outline what they're doing on their journal website, but if you're ever unsure, then do get in touch with the journal to ask, just so you can have certainty and control over how your manuscript's being handled. Next, I'll move on to talk about different types of peer review. I should start by saying that I'm going to talk through these four that you can see on the slide at the moment. There are other types as well that are less common, I guess. Each type of peer review has its own pros and cons, and that's what we're going to talk through. And the other flavors of peer review are no different. If you'd like to move on again, Nicola. I'll start off by talking about single anonymized peer review. You might also have heard of this referred to as single blind peer review, and it's by far and away the most common type of peer review for physical sciences and medical journals. And in a single anonymized peer review model, the reviewers know the name of the authors of the article, but the authors don't know the identities of the reviewers. And the anonymity of the reviewers makes it much easier for them to give full and honest feedback on an article without fear that the author might hold this against them, or it might have further repercussions to funding and things like that, which is often a concern. And of course, from a reviewer's perspective, by knowing who the author is and their affiliation, allows them to use their knowledge of that and the author's previous research when making their decision. On the other hand, of course, knowing who the author is, it might overshadow the quality of the work, potentially leading to a lack of scrutiny, particularly if the work is coming from the research lab of a very prominent author or a particularly high-profile institution, and that can lead to a kind of a number of biases that can enter into reviewer comments. It might also lead to rushed or rude or particularly unfair reviews, which might not have happened if the reviewer's name wasn't associated with the comments. So there are some disadvantages to this as well. The next type of peer review model I mentioned is double anonymized. So this is very similar to single anonymized peer review, but the reviewers are blinded from the authors, but also the authors' identities are blinded from the reviewers. We have a number of journals that offer a double anonymized peer review model in the RSC portfolio, as listed on the side of this slide. Double anonymous peer review is particularly common in humanities, and a number of social sciences, and a number of physical science journals are starting to offer this as an option now as well. Some researchers may prefer a double anonymized peer review model because they might view it as a higher chance of getting a fairer chance through peer review than the single anonymized route. And they may feel that it reduces the risk of unintended bias, or particularly unfavorable bias or negative bias against them. However, researchers, of course, might still be able to figure out the author's identity. Many research topics are iterative in some form and work on the basis of the author's previous work. So particularly if an author's working in a very specialized field, then it may be easier than others to work out who the author's identity is, or at least have a reasonable guess on that. Of course, when looking at the writing style of the paper or looking at the references that have been used, this might also give hints towards who the identity is. So it is a flaw with double anonymized peer review, that the nature of that anonymity might not be clear. Nicola, thank you. The next model I'd like to talk about is transparent peer review. Transparent peer review is where the peer review history is published alongside the manuscript. So this is the peer reviewer reports. This is the author's responses. This is the editor's decision, and it's all published alongside the accepted article, often as supporting information or something along those lines. A number of our journals at the RSC offer transparent peer review, and they're listed along the side, and this is ever growing. The way the RSC operate transparent peer review is authors are given the option to opt in for transparent peer review at any point during the submission and revision of their article. Reviewers are essentially given the chance to opt in or out by accepting or declining the review. But the ultimate choice as to whether to publish the material or not sits with the authors. So the purpose of this model is to increase the transparency of the peer review system, and at the same time protects the identities of reviewers and authors before acceptance, depending on the actual peer review model that's been used. Reviewers are kept anonymous with this approach as standard, and the rationale behind publishing a lot of this work is it can lead to a high quality and more constructive peer review process. Also gives greater accountability, leaves less opportunity for bias and reviewer fraud to come into the process. And the peer review history itself is given a DOI. It becomes citable, which can also be of use. It's also useful as a kind of an educational tool, really. So for particularly earlier career researchers or people who are less familiar with reviewing can see what other reviewers are doing in their reviews, and to get a greater understanding and insight into the peer review process. And for individual manuscripts, transparent peer review can give readers a much better understanding of what stands behind the editor's decision, how that decision was made, and how that paper came to be accepted. It increases the transparency of the peer review system overall, and hopefully the research is judged more fairly with reduction of bias. And the cons are very, very similar to a single or double anonymized peer review approach. It is still quite unfamiliar. It can lead to misconceptions. Many people think that reviewers are made, their names are open, but certainly the approach that we take in our journals is that the review anonymity is maintained. An alternative to transparent peer review is open peer review. Nick, if you move to the next slide, thank you. This is where the identity of the authors and reviewers is known by all participants, and that's where it differs mainly from transparent peer review. There's a growing minority of journals that use this form of peer review, but they are still the minority. And some journals may choose to publish the reviewer identities alongside the paper as well. So rather than just having that information shared with authors and reviewers, it's made publicly available as well. Some of the benefits of this is that, again, the author might receive a more constructive comments and perhaps more polite comments, and as the reviewer name is associated with their review, the reviewer might be motivated to do a much more thorough job when writing their review. The disadvantages, of course, is there's a possibility of a reviewer giving an overly favourable review to the person if there's some kind of knowledge of who they are in the field. And there might be a real reluctance for reviewers to criticise the work of more senior researchers because they may worry about the repercussions. So open peer review, whilst can bring along a number of advantages, there's also some risks that are associated with it. So they're the main types of peer review models. As I say, there are others as well, and they all bring their own pros and cons with them, much like the ones here. The main reason for having multiple different types of peer review models is no model is perfect ultimately, but it provides an author a choice so that authors have a certain amount of control over how their paper is handled through the peer review process. And when choosing a journal, I'd recommend to all authors to make sure that they're choosing the right model for them. And particularly if you're choosing a double anonymized model, remember to anonymize your paper. Many publishers won't do this for you. And they will take your manuscript as you submit it. So if you've not suitably anonymized your paper and you want to go down a double anonymized route, then the reviewer, the publisher might not change this for you. So please do make sure you look into that. And generally speaking, transparent peer review is growing in many ways. A large portion of the community are ever wanting more transparency with the process and increasing transparency in scientific publishing overall. And as a publisher, we're seeking to roll out transparent peer review more widely across our journal portfolio in the coming years. Thank you for listening to my section of the talk. I'll now pass over to Laura to cover the next section.
Great, thanks so much, Jeremy. And we can move straight on to Laura. Welcome, Laura, and take it away.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you for attending the webinar. It's really nice to try to speak to you today. As Nicola mentioned, my name is Laura Fisher. I'm the executive editor for RSC Advances at the RSC. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the reviewing process and how to write good review reports. I noticed there's quite a lot of questions in the chat about how to become a reviewer. So if you pay close attention to my slides, hopefully you will learn a bit about that, and you'll see where you can sign up to become one of our reviewers. Do you want to do the next slide, Nicola? Thank you. So what are the reasons why you might want to become a reviewer? One of the main things is that it will be really helpful for you to develop your skills, both in terms of reviewing, but also in terms of writing papers. So it's a great opportunity to learn how to give constructive feedback. It can help you stay up to date with the field and the research that's currently being published. It gives you the opportunity to read papers before they're even coming out, which is great. It gives you an increased understanding of the standards of journals, which can be really helpful when you're submitting your own work, because it means that you'll have a better idea of which journals your work might be suitable for. It helps you to make sure that published work is trustworthy and accurate, and you can be part of making sure that happens. So that's really great to be able to do and to help contribute to the published community in that way. It also gives you a lot of insight into how articles are assessed, which again can be really helpful when you're then submitting your own work. knowing a little bit more about the process and how it works. And finally, it can really help you develop those critical evaluation skills, which you'll need in the future for things like writing grant proposals, for when you've got students that you're supervising and that kind of thing. So it can really help across the board with a lot of different parts of your development, particularly if you're an earlier career researcher. So it's a really great thing to do, and we really encourage any of you to join our pool of reviewers. In terms of becoming a reviewer, we do have a few requirements. So all of our reviewers need to hold a PhD or equivalent. Of course, some people take different career paths. So for example, if you've gone into industry and you've never actually done a PhD, but you've got a lot of experience working in industry, then that could still be appropriate. Doesn't have to be definitely a PhD, but certainly needs to be an equivalent level of expertise. They need to be current active researchers, so actively still taking part in research in academia or in industry, have recently published in peer-reviewed journals of comparable impact and reputation to the RSC. So it doesn't need to be in one of our journals. You don't have to have published with us or reviewed for us. But if you've reviewed in comparable journals from other publishers, ones that have similar standards, similar topics and that kind of thing, then obviously that means you've got that idea of what those journals are looking for, and that can be really helpful. However, as Sarah said, we are also keen to get new people involved in peer review, and obviously everyone's got to start somewhere. So providing you meet that initial criteria of having a PhD, then we're always happy to have new people join. And yeah, finally, just to mention that our reviewers are generally selected for their expertise and experience. So it might be that you're chosen because you've got a particular expertise in a topic, but it also for a certain paper, we might look for one reviewer who's more experienced to counterbalance someone who's less experienced. So those can both be criteria that are used when we're choosing who to select as a reviewer. We've got a short link on the slide there, rsc.li/reviewer. If you go to that page, there's a lot more information about how to become a reviewer and why you'd want to do it. And it will take you through to our Become a Reviewer page where you can actually sign up and apply, and that will basically get your application sent through so that you can get listed on our database and start reviewing for us. Next slide, please. So a little bit about how to write a review report. So I think the main thing to think about when you're doing this is the main aim of your report is to help the journal to decide if the work is suitable to publish. And in doing that, you're also obviously helping the authors to improve their work as well. So when you first receive a request for a review and you get that paper and you download it and you have a look at it, the first thing to consider is, am I an expert? Am I the right person to be reviewing this paper? And it might be that you're not, and if you're not, then that's okay, and it's much better for you to actually decline that request and wait for a more appropriate one, because you need to bear in mind that if you were having a paper reviewed, you would want the person reviewing it to be an expert. So it's always worth having that discussion with yourself first. The next thing is, will you be able to meet the deadline? And we do ask for reviews to be returned within a couple of weeks. We can be a bit flexible with these, but obviously we do also know that authors want to get their papers reviewed as quickly as possible. So if you think you're really not going to be able to make that deadline, it's much better for you to just tell us that, either to say, can I have a little bit of an extension, or to perhaps just say, sorry, I can't do it this time, and think about doing one another time when you've got a bit more free time on your hands. Another important thing to think about is conflicts of interest. So it's really not appropriate for you to review a paper that's been submitted by one of your colleagues or someone that you've got a close relationship with. So if you do get invited to review a paper for somebody where you feel you can't be unbiased, again, it's a very good time to say, maybe I'm not the right person to review that paper, maybe I should recommend it to somebody else. And if you do decline a request to be a reviewer, it's always really helpful if you can provide a suggestion for another person, and usually there's a box in which you can do that on the invitation, so you can just type in names of other people that you think might be suitable. Okay, next slide, thank you. When you're assessing a paper then, so you've accepted to do the report and you're about to start reviewing it, what do you need to think about? Firstly, is the work understandable and correct? Can you follow it? Can you understand what the authors are trying to do? And do you think they've done it well and done it correctly? Or can you spot any obvious mistakes? Is it interesting, significant, or important? So do you think it's something that's worthy of publication in the journal? And when doing that, think about the journal that you're reviewing for, and that journal's standards and what other things they publish. So for example, if it's a journal like Chemical Science that publishes quite high impact work, think about whether this paper fits in with the rest of that, or whether it's perhaps more suitable for a journal like RSC Advances, where we publish slightly more specialized work. Is the work well presented? Is it easy to follow? Can the authors do anything that might improve the way the paper's written so that it's more attractive and more easy to read for the readers? And that's something that's always helpful to give feedback on. A few important things to remember: keep it confidential. So obviously, if you've been sent a paper, it has not been published yet, you've been trusted to look at that paper yourself. You shouldn't be sharing it with your colleagues and, you know, giving them the scoop on what's about to come out. You also shouldn't reach out to the authors yourself. The idea is that all communication that you have with the authors is through the report that you write that goes back through the editor. So even though you know who those authors are, if it's a single anonymized peer review model, you shouldn't contact them yourself. And do try to be objective. Do try to review the research and what's actually written in the paper, and not allow any thoughts that you have about the research themselves, whether you know them or you know their field of research. Try not to let that cloud your judgment. Next slide, please. So just a quick few list of do's and don'ts when you're writing a review report. Do try to send your report on time. And if you can't, then, you know, please do ask us, and we can usually give you an extension for that. Do try to follow instructions. Quite often you'll be asked to comment on specific parts of a paper, so do try to do that. If you're unsure about anything, do ask questions, do get back to the editor and ask them. Try to be specific. Try to give the authors examples where you think there should be changes made, so that it's really clear what you think needs to be improved. Comment on what you think is interesting, important, or significant, because that can really help the editor in making their judgment. Try to be unbiased and objective, but do alert the editor if you do have any concerns, whether those are with the scientific accuracy or whether there's something in a more kind of ethical way that you're concerned about in terms of what's been presented in the paper. Try to avoid agreeing to do a report that you can't deliver, that you don't have time to deliver. Avoid contacting the authors, as I mentioned. It's also a good idea to avoid making unsupported statements. So, for example, just saying something like "this paper is rubbish" is not very helpful if you can't back up why you think that and what parts of the paper actually make that the case. Again, try to avoid personally criticizing the authors. We're trying to be constructive and help them improve the paper, but it's not helpful to either person if there are personal comments in there. It's all right to make some comments about the understandability of the English, particularly if you find it very hard to follow the paper, but you don't need to focus too much on actually making corrections there. We do have language editing services that the authors can use, and we also do check the language on papers before we publish them, so you don't need to spend a lot of your time actually making those corrections. A simple comment that says "this paper could do with the language being polished" would be enough. Try not to recommend acceptance or rejection without giving any reasons. It's really helpful for the editor if they understand why you're making a recommendation, rather than just just giving that recommendation. And finally, but very importantly, do not ask the authors to cite irrelevant references or a lot of your own papers. So obviously, if you've published something that you think really should have been cited and the authors have missed it, then it's fine to include it. But we are seeing more and more lists of papers from that reviewer asking them to add those papers to the paper, asking the authors to add those papers to their own work, and that's not really very ethical. It's not something that we encourage. You shouldn't be using reviewing as a way to add citations to your own papers. So please do make sure if you're adding recommendations of citations that they are relevant to that paper, and that they cross other authors and not just yourself. Next slide, please. Confidentiality is a key part of the reviewing process, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to keep your name confidential from the authors. You can tell them who you are if you like, but it does mean that you shouldn't be sharing that work in any way. So you can declare publicly that you are a reviewer, and that's fine, and you can use our reviewer recognition processes to do that. And you can sign your comments to the author if you want to, that's completely up to you. But what you can't do is use the unpublished work in any way, keep a copy of it, share it with your colleagues, and you shouldn't reveal publicly the specific papers that you've reviewed, already detailed those reviews. So that's the sort of line there between what you can and can't do. On our website, we do have more information. It's that same link again that I mentioned earlier, rsc.li/reviewer. So we've got some training resources there about being a reviewer, about some of the ethical responsibilities around that, how to write a good review and that kind of thing. So if you're interested in looking at any more of that, please do head over to that link, and I will also share that in the chat if someone hasn't already done that. Next slide, please, Nicola. And then finally, what happens after you've submitted your report? So the editor will consider your report alongside any others. They should have at least one other, but obviously, as Sarah mentioned, they might have more than one. They will then make a decision whether to accept, whether to transfer, reject, or reassess the manuscript after revisions. If the manuscript is given revisions, then it might be that you're asked to provide another review after the revised version has come back. And then usually at the end of the whole process, you'll actually be told what final decision was made on that paper. So that can be really useful, so that you can kind of benchmark what you suggested against what actually happened, and see if the kind of things that you are recommending are similar to what other reviewers are recommending. So yeah, and I mentioned below already that if the review reports don't agree, then if you get one report that says accept this paper and one that says reject it, then the associate editor will hopefully ask for another reviewer to help them make a decision there. Next slide, please. Final thing I think I wanted to say about reviewing is recognition. So we do try to give recognition where we can for our reviewers. They're a huge and important part of our peer review process, and we wouldn't be able to publish anything without them, and none of you would be able to publish anything without reviewers either. So it's really great to make sure we try and recognise them. We partner with Web of Science Reviewer Recognition Service across our journals, which allows you to create your own record and to list all the journals that you've reviewed for. And those usually get approved by the publisher, I think. It's integrated with our Scholar One system, so every time you do a review for us, it can then be linked straight across to your account. As I said before, it won't provide specific details about which papers you've reviewed, but it will say you've reviewed a certain number of papers for our journals. And you can use that kind of thing in your CV on funding applications and that kind of thing to show that you have been doing reviewing. At the RSC, we also do a few other things. So we provide a 25% discount on all our books for reviewers, a 50% discount on affiliate membership of the RSC. And we also do an outstanding reviewers series every year where we recognise a group of the top reviewers for each journal. This is usually based on a number of different criteria, such as number of reviews, quality of reviews, how quickly they're turned around, people who've provided particularly helpful reviews in difficult situations and that kind of thing. So these are looked at and chosen quite carefully by our teams, and we usually recognise 20 or so people for each journal. You get a certificate, and you get included on our kind of editorial that lists the outstanding reviewers. So hopefully that's a really great thing if you do get selected for that. Next slide, Nicola. And the final thing I just wanted to show you, because I think it's quite an interesting infographic, is all about peer review at the Royal Society of Chemistry. So this tells you a little bit about the numbers involved in peer review with us. So for example, this is all in 2022, we had 46,760 different reviewers from 121 different countries. So it really is a huge process being carried out by a large number of people from all across the world, which is really great to see. As you can see, we get a lot of different submissions across our journals, almost 10,000 every month, yeah, over 150,000 reviews were completed in 2022. So it's really great, yeah, there's some really interesting numbers on this slide. So hopefully you'll have picked out some interesting things there as well. Thanks, Nicola. Next slide. Okay, and then I've got a few slides just to talk to you about publication ethics as well, which is obviously also linked to the peer review process. So just to tell you a little bit about what that means, publication ethics governs the behaviours and practices of authors, reviewers and editors during the process of reporting, assessing and disseminating research findings in scholarly journals. So editors are seen as the gatekeepers of this process. So we at the RSC kind of oversee this and make sure that everything is running in an ethical way, and to have certain measures in place in order for us to ensure that we're following ethical guidelines. Next slide, please. So as part of that, we are a member of the Committee on Publication Ethics, as are most, if not all, scholarly publishers. The Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE, provides leadership and in thinking on publication ethics, as well as practical resources to educate and support members, and a professional voice in current debates. So they set out guidelines for how peer review should be run at journals, and in different cases, you can look to them for guidance on how you ought to investigate different cases. So whether it's a case of a dispute between some authors, or a case of somebody falsifying some data, you can go to the Committee on Publication Ethics and find out how they recommend you do things, and we follow that for all of our ethical investigations. Next slide, please. As far as our responsibilities go as a publisher, we are responsible for maintaining the scientific record. So if something's been published, we can't just take it away. That's why we publish retractions. We don't just unpublish things, because once they've been put into the scientific record, they need to stay there. It's our responsibility to follow the processes advised by COPE, as I mentioned before, to be fair and neutral in handling of all cases. So to make sure that we're giving both sides of the argument their chance to speak before we make any decisions, and to report any serious infringement so that action can be taken. So sometimes we do report cases of research malpractice to institutions and that kind of thing for them, in order for them to do further investigation. However, it's important to say that we're not here to police the community or to punish authors. So, for example, if we retract a paper, we will retract it because the research in that paper is not reliable anymore, but we won't retract it just as a punishment to an author. So if there's no reason to retract the paper, because if there's nothing to suggest that the research is not reliable, we won't just do a retraction as a punishment. That's not what our role is. Next slide, please. So what are the common issues that we encounter during publication ethics? We do get a lot of authorship issues. So this is where a paper's been published and then somebody comes in and says, actually, my name should have been on that paper and it wasn't. Or perhaps somebody who's on the paper decides they shouldn't have been on it. So yeah, issues between who should be the authors of a paper, and that can be either before or after publication. Duplicate submissions. So as I'm sure you know, it's not ethical for you to submit one paper to 2 different journals at the same time. But we do see that happen occasionally. And sometimes we see that both those papers then end up getting published, and obviously then one of those needs to be retracted. Systematic manipulation, e.g., we've had situations with fake reviewers or with paper mills where there's large systematic cases where lots of papers have been involved. So that's something that's become more common. Fragmented or redundant submissions. So this is where somebody has split what should be one paper into lots and lots of smaller papers. So potentially where they have tried to publish 5 papers instead of just one by breaking up their research into smaller and smaller bits, or publishing something redundant, so something that's already kind of been covered in another paper. So those are quite often things that we can take action on. Text overlap and plagiarism, so people copying text or data from other authors. And finally, manipulated or fabricated data, so people trying to make their data say something that it doesn't actually say, or using things like Photoshop to change images and that kind of thing. Next slide, please. And what do we do? So there are a number of different things we can do depending on the thing we're investigating. So if a paper is reported to us and there's an ethical concern raised, we will investigate it. We'll investigate anything that is reported to us. There are a number of different things we can do depending on the extremity of what's happened and depending on the outcome of our investigation. So in some cases, we will take no further action if we find that there's nothing unethical that's been done. In some cases, we'll publish a correction if a small update can clarify an issue, particularly if there's a scientific mistake or concern and it can be updated very easily, or if there's nothing ethical going on. We can publish an expression of concern. That's usually a temporary thing, where if we know we're not going to be able to resolve the case quickly, we can put that on a paper just to alert authors that we're unsure about the paper. We can then end up removing that if the investigation eventually finds that paper was fine, or we can end up retracting the paper. This often happens if we need to refer something to an author's institution for further investigation. So we know that investigation will take a lot of time. And then finally, retraction. So if we know that if we discover that a paper should not have been published, the results are not reliable, something's been faked or manipulated, then we can retract the paper, and that's something that we do from time to time, unfortunately. Okay, so that's it from me. Yeah, I will hand back over to Nicola to try and answer some of your questions between us.
Thanks so much, Laura. That was great. If I could I'll stop sharing my screen. I could just ask all our speakers, there we go, to bring our cameras on. We've got a few minutes to address some questions. So we had lots and lots of questions about how to become a reviewer and what are the criteria for reviewing. So I've marked those all as answered because I think we covered that in the presentation already. But I have noticed a couple of people saying that they've expressed their interest or applied to become a reviewer, but haven't yet received any review invitations. And someone specifically asking how they update their research interests and let us know about their research interests. Could we help those people out, do you think? Who would like to take that?
Yeah, I can.
Thanks, Laura.
So yeah, if you'd like to update your research interests, your keywords on our system, the easiest way to do that is to log into Scholar One, which is where it's the same place that you submit manuscripts, the same place that you review manuscripts. That's where all the details are held. Hopefully you will have had a link confirming your Scholar One account when you were added to the reviewer database if you weren't already on there. And I would suggest that if you haven't had any invitations to review yet, a good thing to do is to go and have a look at your account on Scholar One and make sure that you've got lots of keywords assigned to you and that all your research interests are up to date. Because basically what happens is our editors will get a paper, they'll decide what topic it's in, and then they will use the search function within the system to search via keywords and research interests to try and find people. So if you're listed with the right research interests and the right keywords, you'll come up on their search list, and then hopefully they'll invite you. Of course, it does depend a little bit on how many other people are in that list and on whether the editor also knows the people themselves. So we can't guarantee that you'll get invited just because you're on there, but hopefully, the more up to date your account is, the better. And the other thing is that for most of our journals, we do add a little green flag to the accounts of people who are really keen to do reviews and who we know will therefore hopefully return them reliably and quickly. So yeah, if you don't think you've already got that on your account, then please do let us know and we can check that that's there as well.
Great, thanks, Laura. And we had two questions about professors or PIs asking their lab members, whether that's postdocs, PhD students or others, to assess manuscripts that they agree to review, and they are asking about that practice and whether that's okay and how that might work. Who would like to come in on that one?
I can answer that if you like.
Great, thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, no, I mean, ultimately that's fine. It's the PI's responsibility to return the report and to ensure that they're happy with all the comments that are being made. But we do appreciate that it's an important part of doctoral training, really, to learn how to review and things like that. What we ask is for transparency ultimately, so that if a PI is submitting a report that a student or someone in their group has helped them with, that they note that to us so that we're aware. With all reviewer reports that come back, there is a section for reviewers to add confidential comments that just go through to the editor, and we've just asked them to pop some details in there. If it's someone who, if it's perhaps a postdoc in the group, someone who is fully able to review in their own right, then it might be worth getting back in touch with the journal and asking if that person can be invited directly, because then they can claim the review as their own, if they're going to be the sole writer of it. So it's worth bearing that in mind as well.
That's great. Thanks, Jeremy. And I think that answers another question from someone asking about the fact that they're a PhD student and are there opportunities. And I think that's perhaps the way to do it, is to work with their supervisor in that kind of approach. Great, thank you. Another question that's received a few upvotes, suggesting that desk rejections are perhaps more common than they used to be, and feeling that even if their paper satisfies the scope of the journal, they're being more commonly desk rejected, and asking why don't the editors let the reviewers decide the destiny of the manuscript?
I can pick this one up.
Great, thank you, Sarah.
So yeah, sorry, I was just having a little read. Essentially, yes, we do desk reject papers if we don't think that the manuscript is clearly suitable for publication. So the question mentioned about scope, but for example, we're also looking of the impact of the work as well. So if we feel that the work doesn't meet that right impact level, or significance or novelty levels, that's also a reason, along with scope, that a paper might not be peer reviewed in a journal. And as I mentioned in my presentation, I think it also reduces burdens on reviewers having to review a lot of papers, and does provide a quicker decision for authors, so that you can potentially go and submit somewhere else quickly, possibly an RSC journal if we're able to transfer as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Sarah. I've got a question about the double anonymized peer review. Someone saying this is obviously more objective and fair. What are the obstacles to make all journals double anonymized? Laura, is that something you'd be able to comment on?
Yeah, so I think the main thing is some of what Jeremy mentioned in his talk around the kind of benefits and drawbacks of double anonymized peer review. One of the main things at the moment that we've noticed is that actually it's quite difficult for authors to anonymize their paper, and we don't have a system to do that automatically our side. So it relies on the authors to actually make sure that their names are listed in the paper. You've also got to be very careful about things like, for example, if you say in our previous work and then you put a reference, then people could go look at the reference list and work out who you were. So at the moment, it's quite difficult for that anonymization process to be done reliably. And that means that we don't want to make it mandatory for all authors, because it kind of defeats the object of us doing it if it doesn't really perform its purpose of being anonymous. And it would also give an extra barrier to authors to have to try and go through those steps of anonymizing their paper. And if that then didn't end up even working very well, then it wouldn't be great. So that's the main thing. We have been trialing it on a number of journals, and looking at the take up, and that has been quite variable. So some of our journals it's been around 25%, but on others it's been as low as sort of 7 or 8%. So it depends a little bit on the journal, and we are sort of looking into whether this is something people are interested in and continuing to assess it. And we'll also be continuing to monitor whether the process for anonymization improves, and whether, for example, ScholarOne come up with a better system of doing that. And if that does happen, then it might be something that we take forward in the future. I think we do think that it could be really beneficial in terms of reducing bias in peer review. So if there was a way that we could roll it out and make it work well for everyone and make it fair, then I think we'd like to do that. But it's just a case of making sure that it works properly.
Yeah, exactly, Laura. Thanks. And I think it is about those sort of practical realities, isn't it? And about our communities as well. As you said, Laura, when we do offer double anonymized peer review, the uptake is actually quite low, and there's a certain barrier to anonymizing your manuscript. So, we obviously need to be careful to bring our community with us when we make changes to important things like the peer review on our journals. So thank you so much for that. I'm afraid we're absolutely out of time. We had lots and lots of questions. We've tried to answer as many as we possibly can. So I hope you've enjoyed the session and found it useful and informative. And we thank you all again very much for attending. And we hope that you will follow the link to find out more about becoming a reviewer. And we hope this webinar has been helpful in supporting you to do that. So thank you very much to everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.